Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius Podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy in my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out. And I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now to our guest.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. My guest today is Christine Purdon. She's a professor at the University of Waterloo, and we're going to talk about anxiety and other cognitive manifestations. So, Christine, thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, tell me about your background and what got you interested in this subject.
So I've been at the University of Waterloo since 1997, and I've been studying anxiety since I was a graduate student. And I think what I find so interesting about anxiety is that it's a response that we need to have. We absolutely have to have an anxiety response, or we couldn't survive threats and danger. But what I find so interesting is that in some people, this normal, very normal adaptive response can become so problematic for them and so pervasive that it severely limits their capacity to function. And anxiety disorders are actually significant causes of disability on par with physical diseases like diabetes. And the impact on the economy is upwards towards where tobacco use is. So it seemed to me it's a sort of a widespread mental health issue. And again, I was intrigued by how can a response that's normal become something that was so functional become something that's so dysfunctional for people.
Well, what is it like when you work with someone that has the various types of anxiety disorders? Like what are the names of maybe the top few? How do they manifest? We'll get into it.
Yeah, so the term on anxiety disorders includes, well, actually they call it anxiety and related disorders. So it would include things like social anxiety, so where people have a lot of self-consciousness in social situations to the point where it actually makes it really challenging for them to get into social situations. And they may function okay, but they find it highly aversive. And the self-consciousness is quite devastating. There's also panic disorder, which is characterized by panic attacks, which are sudden and quite terrifying episodes where people are sort of, going about their life, and then suddenly, boom, they're feeling overwhelmed with panic and anxiety. And then they start modifying their life in order to avoid another one being triggered. Another anxiety disorder is what we call generalized anxiety disorder. And this is one that's characterized by really excessive worry. So we all worry from time to time, but somebody with generalized anxiety disorder might find themselves spending a lot of their day worrying, thinking, okay, well, what if I can't park here when I need to drop this off, and then I'm late, and then I can't drop it off, and then the office is closed, and if I can't drop it off, then they may not accept it tomorrow. And so it just goes on. And at the end of it, it's like, there's a catastrophic sort of outcome because they're anticipating into the future the worst outcome of the worst outcome of the worst outcome. So then there's also related disorders such as obsessive compulsive disorder, which is characterized by the occurrence of obsessional thoughts, which are unwanted, intrusive thoughts that return even though you don't want to have them and create a lot of distress, and typically are handled by some kind of strategy to reduce that distress. So by washing and checking are some of the more common ones, but it can also be an internal strategy, such as reciting lucky numbers or saying a prayer or trying to think a good thought in response to a bad thought, or seek reassurance from somebody else or from yourself. There's also health anxiety, where people can be really concerned that there's something quite wrong with them that people haven't been able to find or figure out or diagnose properly yet. And so there's a lot of preoccupation with am I sick, and doing tests and Googling, doing a lot of internet searches, getting different opinions from medical professionals, etc. And there's also body dysmorphic disorder, which is where somebody's excessively self-conscious about one or two perceived flaws in their appearance. So they may be very concerned that, say, their nose is too big, and so they focus excessively on checking and trying to find ways to disguise it, etc. So those are some of the main manifestations of anxiety.
Yeah, it's a lot of different ones, and they very different manifestations. And yeah, I don't know if I've seen them all, but I've certainly heard of all of them. Are there a lot more? Those are just the major ones, or is that it?
Yes, those are the most, what we might call some of the more common ones, but we can also, like there's with panic disorder, often people with panic disorder also will have what we call agoraphobia, which is that because of the panic symptoms, the person really restricts their range of movements, and they become very, very concerned. Like for example, some people with panic disorder may not want to go into a wide open space because that brings on the sensations that are similar to a panic attack. Or they may not want to go out alone because if they have a panic attack, somebody won't be there to help them out. Or they may avoid driving because they're afraid they'll have a panic attack and crash the car or something like that. There are also specific phobias. So phobias of very specific stimuli like spiders or snakes, for example. And
is each phobia considered a different disorder or different manifestation of anxiety, or not necessarily?
Yeah, so in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, each one of the things that I mentioned would be considered a separate disorder. They're often fairly comorbid, like what we call comorbid, which is that if you have one anxiety disorder, you are more likely to have another anxiety disorder. And anxiety and depression are often very comorbid.
Are people, do they tend to be born with these, or do they manifest at different ages and circumstances?
That is such a good question. So one thing we know is that the temperament of a baby from around the age of 2 weeks can help us. There's an anxious temperament that they talk about. And so a baby with an anxious temperament is more likely to go on to develop an anxiety issue. We know that there is some genetic factor. We also know that if somebody has an anxiety disorder, there's a greater chance that somebody in their immediate family also has one. And so one pattern we see is that if one or both parents are very anxious, the child is, even if there's no necessarily genetic influence, the child learns an anxious way of responding and learns that, that bad things are, just around the corner and going to happen, or the child learns an avoidant response to threats, so withdraws from novelty or things that are uncertain to them rather than approach and learn something new about them. So there's certainly like a nurture component to it. And in fact, a lot of the people that I work with anxiety, that one of the reasons that they've come to see me is because they don't want their children to learn the anxious ways that they've learned. And they want to be able to respond to anxious triggers differently for the sake of their children.
I'm sure everyone's asking you this question. The past year and a half, this virus crap, how has that affected everyone, and what has it done to the anxiety profiles that you see?
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click support us today. Now back to the show.
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think there was a lot of concern initially that because of the uncertainty and the sense of danger, particularly at the very beginning of it all, when we seemed to know so little about the virus and how it was transmitted. And we thought that it could be transmitted through surface contact, which meant that it seemed very easy to get. And we didn't, it was very easy to get and difficult to protect yourself from. And so there was a lot of concern that people, for example, with obsessive compulsive disorder who do a lot of hand washing might accelerate their symptoms, or that it would create like greater anxiety for people with generalized anxiety disorders. So far, there hasn't been good epidemiological data to suggest that there's been a change in prevalence rates of anxiety. What instead I think is happening is that people without anxiety disorders are more anxious, but that's a normal response to a very stressful kind of circumstance. And in some ways, people with anxiety disorders may actually be better because, for example, somebody with obsessive compulsive disorder, well, now everybody's following the rules. Everybody's washing their hands and covering their mouth and staying home and avoiding contact. Their family members may now all be home because they're confined. And so they have control. They can count heads. They can manage the environment much better. People with social anxiety may find that, if they don't have to be in public anymore, and on Zoom calls, they can turn their camera off, or they can manage their social presentation much differently. And people with GAD might think, okay, well, the other shoe's dropped. Now I know what to worry about. Now I know what to do. And in fact, people with generalized anxiety are often really, really good in a crisis because they feel very secure now, because they've been waiting for a shoe to drop. Like they've been assuming something bad was going to happen. Well, now it's happened and they know what to do. So I think that there's no one size fits all sort of model for this. And there's no doubt that, but one thing I would say, I didn't talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, but of course that's another anxiety and related disorder, which is where there's a traumatic response to a life-threatening or very seriously extreme situation. And I think that there's been people, frontline workers, and also people who've lost loved ones to COVID have experienced a lot of trauma. So because the healthcare workers are there and they're dealing with something they've never had to deal with before in their lives. So, nurses who have been on a neonatal unit are suddenly being seconded over to the ICU and have to intubate very, very sick people who are very young and have families. And they have to suddenly master skills that are very sophisticated. And of course, many people who frontline workers have had to sit and be the only one to accompany somebody while they die, and be the one that holds up the iPad to the family members. And so these tragic, really difficult to accept situations can be very, very profoundly affecting for people, or loved ones who you can't get in to see their relative and only say goodbye through an iPad. So that can be traumatic. And being intubated can also lead to trauma. It has, if you come out the other side of being intubated, the actual memory of being intubated and everything that's happened to you can be traumatic. So I think that once life starts to really go back to normal, we might find actually a little bit more trauma, people more a greater percentage of people with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, mainly because there's been a lot more of the population exposed to trauma than in the past. And we also may find that people with, say, social anxiety who've been kind of able to hide now have to come out again. And that may be harder because they're not used to it. So I think initially we're going to see some people with anxiety problems may start to have more symptoms. I'm not sure that the actual prevalence rates, though, are going to change apart from PTSD.
Has it been studied on, you certainly wouldn't want to, it would be unethical to traumatize people, but is there any observation or knowledge of how long it takes to traumatize someone? And I know it depends on the intensity, it depends on the person, et cetera, but are there any guardrails here?
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Yeah, so one thing I should say is that post-traumatic stress disorder is not the norm. So it's very normal immediately in the six weeks to 3 months following a trauma for people to have a lot of symptoms. But for many people, those symptoms resolve on their own, and some people don't even have a lot of trauma symptoms. And so it's still not going to be the norm that anybody exposed to trauma is going to get PTSD. So it's more that a lot more people have been exposed to traumas, therefore there's going to be a larger general proportion of people who are going to have PTSD in the population, but it'll still be the same rate. So I think we're very resilient as humans, and I think we forget that we have great capacity to grow and adjust and adapt, and sometimes find meaning in trauma. So I think that there's been some research on like who goes on to develop trauma and who doesn't. And your question's very good. We can't traumatize people, but we can do things like look at people who've had a similar kind of car accident and sort of follow people and find out who, what might be different about people who go on to develop trauma, or soldiers in war, or people who have survived the same kind of traumatic experiences. And it probably has a lot to do with how you experience that trauma, whether you felt out of control, whether you felt there was what we call a moral injury, like a sense that this was a very unjust event that never should have happened. And the people around me let me down. So if people are feeling like their hospital leadership, for example, created circumstances that actually made the trauma worse or made the conditions for people with COVID worse, there may be this moral element that makes it harder to accept and to move on from. So, but again, it's not the norm. It's the more like it's fewer people go on to develop trauma. It doesn't mean that they're weak. It just means that the trauma has affected them differently.
Yeah, you mentioned moral injury. I recently, heard about it, and it makes sense because if you're a police officer and you see terrible things many times, then you become hardened. Or if you're in war, or if someone's a prostitute, they're injured in a different way too. Or if they're a police officer, like I said, or a judge. It seems like moral injury can affect a lot of different professions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an element that's common across different types of situations that can be traumatic.
So in terms of the anxieties, though, can all of them, have you observed all of them produced by circumstance, or do some of them just seem to come from nowhere? Again, they seem to be hereditary.
Yeah, so we do know that children who are anxious are more likely to grow up to be adults who are anxious. So we know that for sure. And this is why trying to get mental health services to kids is actually really important. And so in terms of, so for some people, yes, there'll be some kind of trigger event, like with a specific phobia, for example, somebody might have had a dog bite, or they might have seen their parent get bit by a dog, and now they're scared of dogs. With generalized anxiety, social anxiety, it's hard. Like, it just seems that we don't have a good understanding of why some people have it and some people don't. We do know that people with social anxiety will often report bullying experiences, humiliating experiences, but it's also hard to know if that's because if that triggered the social anxiety, or whether they already had social anxiety and therefore maybe were a little bit more reserved in social settings, and then were targeted by bullies and picked on for being different in some way. So yeah, I would love to know why they develop and persist, but I mean, we have some good understanding of why they persist. I think in terms of development, it's just really hard to know right now.
So are you doing all clinical work or research as well, or a combo?
I do a combination. I have a small private practice, which is really helpful to me to actually hear people's stories and find out what do the people having these issues, what are they confused about? What would they like fixed? What do they want to understand about themselves? And that gives me very good ideas for what I should be researching. What are the key questions that I should be researching? So my research has looked at one set of research has looked at what happens when we become anxious internally. So looking at how anxiety shapes our information processing. So when we're anxious, we become very threat focused. That is, that we attend to information that is or could be threatening at the expense of other information. And that's very helpful to us. If a lion's about to pounce, then we should really be very focused on that threat and how to fight or flee it. But if we suddenly become anxious because we realize, we hadn't heard from somebody in a couple of days, and now we start to wonder, are they mad at us? Did I say something wrong? We can start to become quite anxious, and immediately we become very threat focused in our processing. So we start to think through, and all we can remember are, negative things that we might have said to this person, or that time they did get really mad at us, or, something that we're ashamed or embarrassed about that we did. And we start to think about like the texts that we've sent, and suddenly we think, oh, somebody could read that text and they could think I meant this when actually I meant that. And nowhere in all that processing is the person able to remember times when they, this person was really friendly towards them. They had a great relationship, that the person might have gotten mad at them once, but got over it very quickly. So we don't reference information that's positive, even neutral. And so some of my research has looked at what happens attentionally when we're anxious and what we can do about that. And then the other set of research that I do looks at the kinds of strategies people do to try to reduce their anxiety, and in particular in the context of obsessive compulsive disorder. So we are looking at compulsions and why compulsions persist and how anxiety prolongs them.
You mentioned other cognitive distortions, at least in your bio. So I don't know if this qualifies, but I've seen sometimes when, let's say, someone I've spoken to will try to read my mind or thinks they read my mind. And I said, yeah, how do you know what I'm thinking? Is that an example of a cognitive distortion, or if not, what are?
Yeah, so I tend to not prefer the language. I don't. If I have cognitive distortion in my bio, I'm going to fix it every time. I tend not to like to use that word, because actually what can happen is that we can come to anxiety can cause us to come to an anxiety relevant conclusion very quickly without a second thought. So, for example, if our boss walks by us in the hall and doesn't say hello, our mind can immediately go to, oh my gosh, he is really displeased with my work and I'm about to get fired. And then the anxiety presents that idea on a silver platter as if it's a fact. And then we start behaving or thinking like we're about to get fired, when in fact we have no information whatsoever that that's happened. And so some people might say that conclusion, my boss is going to fire me, is a distortion. I would say it's a logical product of anxiety hijacking. It's very logically consistent with what the anxiety is saying. So the anxiety is immediately interpreting the boss's behavior as personal, and then immediately saying, well, if it's personal and he's not talking to you, what did you do wrong? And it's sort of a logical product of reasoning. But yeah, so the idea that other people often when they say mind reading in the literature, what they're referring to is you reading someone else's mind. So in this case, this person is reading the boss's mind. Oh, he's doing this because he's really mad at me and I did a bad job. So that's like a kind of mind reading.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to know, right? Are there, so you would call these what, anxiety induced?
I think of them as the anxiety's kind of hijacked the normal processes, and it's only presenting you or allowing you to think about negative or threatening information at the expense of neutral or positive information. So as you're walking down the hall and you have that sudden conclusion, you don't remember, that, 2 weeks ago you got a fantastic performance report, or that you and the boss were laughing together in the photocopy room yesterday. That information is sort of cut off when the anxiety takes over. So I think of it more as it's anxiety hijacking information processing.
Yeah, I could see taking it from my point of view, but that would make me mad, because I would, if someone, let's say I was the boss and the person thought that and somehow they told me, I would get mad, because I would think, well, didn't we just have a fun time the other day, and what about this, what about that? And I would think that the person forgot it all, or just it didn't seem to matter, and it would make me angry. What's the dynamic of the people that anxious people interact with? What's that called, and what happens there?
Yeah, so there can be a lot of interpersonal consequences to anxiety. So, for example, just like you talked about, if the boss, if you say to the boss, oh, I thought you were mad at me, the boss could think, well, why would you think that I would be so unprofessional to let you know I'm to just not to glare at you in the hallway, or whatever it is you think I did, if I was, because I'm more professional than that. And secondly, we just had a really good evaluation, what's making you think that I'm so fickle that I would change my opinion. So yes, it can be sort of perturbing to people, and some people might actually feel quite, kind of like annoyed that somebody would think that of them. The other thing that happens is people with anxiety often want a lot of reassurance. So the person with generalized anxiety, for example, may call somebody frequently throughout the day just to kind of quell their own anxiety, like to say, "Are you home? Did you get there okay? Did you pick that up okay?" And that can be draining for family members. People with obsessive compulsive disorder, well, we know that the vast majority of people with OCD involve family members in their obsessions and compulsions. So one way they involve them is they require the family to follow certain rules. So, you cannot come into the house until you've taken your shoes off and washed your hands. Or if you go for groceries, you can't put batteries in your food. Batteries all have to be stored in a separate bag. So that's one way. The other way is a lot of reassurance seeking. So saying, "Is the stove off? Are you sure? Can you check the stove for me?" Or requiring the other person to take responsibility. "No, you lock up. I don't want to do it." Or "I don't want to drive because I think, I'm going to worry I'm going to hit somebody, so you have to drive." And so this can certainly strain relationships. Or people with health anxiety can, just be so focused on their health that they become like just overly focused and unable to be of support to other people sometimes, or the conversation just always goes back to their concern about their health, which can be trying for people. People with panic disorder may have lots of rules and limits about what they're willing to do or not willing to do in order to avoid a panic attack, and may require, they won't go out alone and require accompaniment and such. So, or people with social anxiety can ask for a lot of reassurance, or they can also immediately assume that they've upset somebody when they haven't. And again, that can actually lead to people being upset with them, like you pointed out.
I just wonder, like, you're right, the interaction of the anxious, I'll just call them that, with people that are not, I'm sure it creates a lot of friction. And again, I'm thinking also about the past 18 months of, what if you have someone that's prone to panic attacks and they work at a grocery store and they're put on the front door and they're supposed to check people coming in, their temperature and stuff like that. And they're so anxious themselves. And now they've been told, like, everyone's going to die. And yet they have to check people coming into the store. I'm sure you don't get good dynamics there. So,
it's hard to know. I think many people would just refuse to do it if they were that anxious. Some people don't have the luxury of being able to do that. I think that people with anxiety, one thing they are good at is self-control. So I think in the situation you're talking about, that the person at the door might be a little bit reactive, like, if don't come in here if you have a mask, and may speak sharply to people. Yeah, I think that's true. And we forget that anxiety is a fight response as well as a flight response. So sometimes when people are anxious, they can actually come across as very angry, and it's because they're just very frightened. So
are there emotions that kind of like two-sided coins, like anger and fear? Are they paired, and are there other emotions that are paired that manifest in these kind of disorders?
So I think in anxiety, I think anxiety and anger can be quite paired, and people can become very angry if they think people aren't taking their anxiety seriously. And often they're told by relatives, "Just calm down, stop worrying. You worry too much. No, I'm not going to reassure you again." And people can become very angry at family members because they are feeling very threatened. So yes, anger and threat are the two responses in anxiety, because it is a fight or flight kind of response. And people with anxiety can also be very focused inwardly, like trying to sort something out mentally. So somebody with OCD may be in a mental bubble, trying to remember everything that their handbag touched while they were out doing an errand, so they can figure out where they need to wipe it, or whether or not it can even come into the house. Or they might be trying to remember whether or not they turn the stove off. And when they're interrupted, people can be really irritable because they're desperately trying to solve what they think is an extremely important problem or issue for them. And they're trying to reassure themselves, and can be touchy if they're pulled off course on that.
So what does some of the therapy look like? I guess just give you one example. I'm not sure if this is therapy, but my wife sometimes is anxious, and I used to say to her, "What's the matter?" And that didn't go over too well. So somehow I figured out to say, "Well, what are you feeling right now? How do you feel right now?" And that works better. She'll say, "Oh, I feel anxious," or "I'm worried." I say, "What are you worried about?" "I'm worried about everything." happens to be worried about everything, but at least it gets the conversation going, you know?
Yeah. And I think you're right. Like, I think what your wife might be communicating is like, it's a challenging question to answer because she's feeling maybe overwhelmed, and doesn't even necessarily know, like, there's just so much going on. Or people with anxiety, if they actually reveal what they're anxious about, they may have learned that other people will. I'm not saying that this is in your case, but other people may have been mocked or caused to feel stupid about what they're anxious, or else the person will say, "Oh, you're so silly. Just stop it. Just stop it." And for them, though, the concern is very, very real. And what we work on when I'm working with people, it's about recognizing when the anxiety is in the driver's seat and taking a moment to pause. And instead of saying, "I'm so anxious right now," be able to say, "I'm aware of being anxious right now," and taking a mental step backward and saying, what are the ideas that are driving my anxiety right now? What is it I'm afraid is going to happen? And why do I think that's going to happen? And taking time to actually what we call down-regulate the anxiety response, and remember and help people start to identify those conclusions the anxiety brings on a silver platter, and saying, okay, so your anxiety took a leap there. You had an instance where you were walking by your boss in the hall, and your anxiety immediately concluded that you were in trouble at work. But if we zoom out and we take into account all the information that's available to us, we need to let's see if that conclusion still works. So let's think about a really nice interaction with your boss in the photocopy room. Let's think about your performance report. Let's think about the kind of work you've been doing and pull this in. Is this conclusion still the best conclusion about why the boss behaved like they did? And so it can help people, like, it's like the anxiety focuses you on threat. What I try to do is help people learn to be able to zoom out and look at all the relevant information and then draw a conclusion so that they can act rather than react.
Yeah, that sounds like a good strategy that people can try. What about, again, if you know or live with or interact with someone that has, one of these conditions, are there any helpful tips for you to work with that person so they don't like punch you out? Or
Yeah, I think, first of all, I would say anxiety is treatable. And a lot of people just don't end up in treatment, but anxiety is really treatable. So if somebody's having a lot of anxiety throughout the day, they may be thinking there's a lot to be anxious about, but actually, even if there's a lot to be anxious about, we don't have to be anxious. And so we can manage situations even without being anxious, even if there's a lot going on. So I would first say, get help, find a good psychologist or therapist who knows a lot about treating anxiety and get help that way. The second thing that it's more about what somebody with anxiety tells us there's threat. And so our natural inclination is to avoid, so if we went to a mall once and we had a panic attack, we might avoid going back to that mall. Well, what we know 100% is that if we face our fears systematically, if we're afraid of dogs, find somebody who has a cute, fluffy dog and spend time with that cute, fluffy dog so that you can get new learning about dogs. If you had a panic attack at the mall, go back to that mall and just stay there. You might feel uncomfortable at first, but wait it out. You might even have a panic attack. Panic attacks are unpleasant, but they're not dangerous. Wait it out. And what we find 100% when people actually expose themselves to their fears in a way that allows them to get new learning, in a way where they can look at what did they expect to happen and compare it to what actually happened. So to get that new learning, it takes the anxiety away, actually, the excessive anxiety. So that's really important. For somebody who's lives with somebody who's anxious, I think it's important to not say calm down or to say stop worrying. Just you could ask them to ask themselves, first of all, to frame it. Okay, so you're aware of being anxious. What kinds of conclusions is the anxiety bringing, and what's information? What is all the information? So you could kind of coach people a little bit like that and see how that goes. But definitely don't say calm down, because never in the history of telling people to calm down has a single person ever calmed down.
So you're saying you ask the person what conclusions is the anxiety telling you?
Yeah. Yeah. So let's start with, you're aware of being anxious. What is the anxiety telling you right now? What is the anxiety voice saying to you? And let's step out of that. Like what I usually, I differentiate the anxiety from the person. So let's say the person I'm talking to, let's say their name is Fatima. I would say right now I want to talk to Fatima. I don't want to talk to Fatima's anxiety. What does Fatima have to say about the situation? And Fatima might say, well, I know I'm probably overreacting about the boss. Yeah, okay, so what is it that makes you think you might be overreacting? Well, I had this good report and blah, blah. So, okay, so Fatima, let's now put that in perspective. Let's look at all the information and let's think about what is the best conclusion for this situation rather than what the anxiety says the conclusion is. So I try to differentiate the person from their symptoms.
Well, the person doesn't get offended. Like I'm not a multiple personality.
Oh yeah, well no.
Don't talk to me like that.
Yeah, well, no, this wouldn't be done without the context of a good relationship. But I think I think people identify an anxiety voice or an OCD voice or a depression voice, and what we want to do is the internal self-talk. Like we know these people are not psychotic. We all engage in internal self-talk. So it's just that when the anxiety is talking, it means it's hijacked and it's kicked the other person out of the driver's seat, and we can help them reclaim it.
It seems like there's a dividing line, or I wonder if there is, people that are anxious about a certain thing that they identify, and then other people seem to be anxious, but they don't know what it is. It's like generalized, invisible. It's like a phantom. Out of these two, are there two types of this? And what do you do? Like become the other?
Well, usually people can have sort of a vague sense of dread, and that's not uncommon with panic, is that there's this sense of amorphous dread. I think one thing I do is I help people learn progressive muscle relaxation, not for panic, but for just a sort of a generalized sense anxiety with no particular focus or target. I think there it can be really important to just reduce the tension in your muscles and reduce your breathing, like get out of the hyperventilation, get out of the, and calm the body, and that helps calm the mind. And so it's a skill, but there are particular ways of going about it that I use with people. But often I think it's rare that there's just sort of untethered anxiety. Like I think that typically what happens is anxiety can get triggered for no good reason, but then people try to pin it on something. Like people think if I'm anxious, there must be something to be anxious about. And so that's where worry comes from, is people's like, oh, well, why am I feeling anxious? Oh, Bob's not home. I wonder if Bob got in an accident. Like, so there, people are like, we try to understand, we try to have an understanding of why we're anxious. So we'll often try to focus or direct our anxiety. And so often people will then we can say, okay, well, when you're anxious, what goes through your head? Well, the environment, the politics, the this, the that, the this, the that. And what we want to do is regroup people about what is it you need to do in the here and now? Like, do you need to put the laundry on? Do you need to make a meal? Do you need to go for a run? And so just kind of bring people back to the here and now and what it is they need to accomplish in the moment. The other thing that's very, very helpful for anxiety is burning off the adrenaline, because the adrenaline leaves you all revved up and nothing to flee or fight. So getting out and burning off that adrenaline can actually be very, very helpful for anxiety.
Yeah, what I was wondering is if someone is generally anxious, are they better off than someone that knows what they're anxious about, or either way it doesn't matter?
And I don't think so. I think there's just sort of they have challenges in different ways, but I think it's equally unpleasant and difficult.
What about depression? What's the interplay of that and anxiety? Does one lead to another? Do you start with one and then you become the other, or vice versa?
That's hard to know. There's been a bit of research, so for example, with obsessive compulsive disorder is most comorbid with depression and social anxiety. And in one study that's been done, the depression came after the OCD, which can make sense because having OCD can be very depressing. It can limit your activities. It can get you caught in these mental loops that part of you knows is irrational and certainly everyone else around you says is irrational, but yet you can't seem to help yourself. We also know that if people are depressed, they can become very anxious, because depression is characterized by a sense of failure and worthlessness and incompetence, or in some cases just a complete absence of any kind of emotion. And so the person it feels very ineffectual. And if you feel like you're a failure, if you feel very ineffectual, if you feel very weak, then you can start thinking, oh my gosh, like, how am I ever going to do X or Y? How am I ever going to get this project done? What if this keeps lasting and I'm on long-term disability already? What if I can't ever get back to work? And so people can flip into the catastrophic future and start worrying tremendously. Or people who've had depression often can get very worried about whether they're going to have another episode, because it was such an aversive experience and so debilitating. So those two things can very much go together.
So what do you see as the future of treatment? Is it working? That just needs to be, people need to see a therapist and that's the answer? Or are there missing treatments, or what's needed from here?
Yeah, I think there's a tiered approach. So I think if you're bothered by anxiety, excessive anxiety sometimes, then there are really excellent websites with resources with them. And what you're looking for is cognitive behavior therapy, like a cognitive behavior approach, where it guides you through being able to expose yourself to what it is that you're afraid of. If you're anxious a lot of the time, even if you think, well, I'm anxious a lot of the time because there's so much to be anxious about, actually that probably means that you're having far more anxiety than you need to be having. And we can help people find ways to not be anxious, even though there's lots of stuff and uncertainty out there. And I think it is really, again, anxiety is so treatable. And in 6 to 12 sessions, you can actually really cure anxiety with the cognitive behavior therapy. So I would definitely recommend that. So I think what people need to do is always, like, so one principle is exposure, right? Like, so if you're afraid of going to that mall, if you're afraid of driving there, do it, but do it multiple times. So do it and think about be conscious of what do I expect is going to happen, and then what actually happens. And then do it again, do it at least 10 times. And I think that people can really conquer their fears by doing those sorts of things. But if the fears stay, if they're really debilitating, if it's really severely impacting ability to get on with your work or function in your family role or socialize with your friends, then yeah, I think seeing somebody and getting formal help is a good idea.
Well, very good. It's been a great call. What's the best way for people to get in touch with you, and where do you serve people?
So I have a very tiny private practice, but people can email me at my University of Waterloo address. And there are also lots of resources online now. So if you type in cognitive behavior therapy for X or Y in my area, you will probably find psychologists or therapists who can help you too.
Well, very good.
Okay.
Well, Christine, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.